Fame can make a transformation look simple from the outside. A new image appears, the headlines follow, and the world acts as if it has understood the whole story. But for many public figures, the real journey begins long before the cameras catch up, in private moments filled with fear, confusion, resistance, and finally, the decision to live more honestly than ever before. In this video, we are looking at 8 transgender celebrities whose stories became larger than before and after. Each one reflects not just a visible change, but a deeply personal turning point that reshaped identity, public perception, and the meaning of courage under pressure. And if stories like these are the reason you enjoy this channel, subscribing is a simple way to stay with us. Now, let us begin with someone whose presence made overlooking them nearly impossible. To the public, she was unforgettable on sight. With a height that instantly set her apart, Ervin carried the kind of presence that could dominate a runway, a camera frame, or an entire room without saying a word. In an industry built on image, that made her impossible to miss. But being noticed and being understood were never the same thing. Before the world knew her as Erika, she had already spent years living inside that gap. People saw the spectacle first. They saw the height, the scale, the shock of someone who did not fit the usual frame. What they did not see was the much quieter struggle underneath it, the effort to make peace with an identity that could not stay buried forever. For someone whose body already drew attention everywhere, there was no easy way to disappear while figuring out who she really was. That pressure could have turned into silence. Instead, it became part of the strength that later defined her. When Erika began living openly as a woman, the change was not about creating a dramatic new persona. It was about finally giving truth the same visibility her appearance had always had. From there, she moved into modeling and acting with a kind of command that felt natural, not forced. Her work eventually brought her wider attention, especially through American Horror Story, Freak Show, where her presence on screen felt too powerful to reduce to novelty. A friend once advised her to tell her story in a place where people might be more open to hearing it. That detail says a lot about the world she had to move through, and even more about the courage it took to keep moving anyway. Erika did not become remarkable when the world finally learned her name. She became remarkable when she refused to let the world decide who she was. Confidence was the image people came to associate with Laverne Cox. By the time she became one of the most recognizable transgender women on television, she seemed poised, articulate, and completely at home in herself. Her rise through Orange is the New Black gave the public a figure who felt strong enough to carry both visibility and representation at once. What the audience saw, though, came after years of pain that were far less visible. Growing up in Alabama, Laverne learned early that femininity could make a child stand out in the worst possible way. She was mocked, judged, and treated as if the most natural parts of her identity were something to be corrected. In an environment shaped by rigidity and religious pressure, even self-expression could feel dangerous. Dance became one of the first places where she could breathe a little easier. It gave her structure, movement, and a language for emotions she could not yet fully explain. But that did not erase the loneliness underneath. The shame and confusion around her identity became so heavy that, while still very young, she attempted to end her life. She survived. And that survival changed the meaning of everything that came after. Years later, after moving to New York and embracing her identity more fully, she began building a life that finally felt closer to the truth. Then came Sophia Bursette. That role did more than bring her fame. It gave mainstream television a transgender character played with humanity, dignity, and emotional weight by someone who understood every layer of that struggle from the inside. Laverne once said, "I think it's revolutionary for any trans person to choose to be seen and visible in a world that tells us we should not exist." That is why her story stayed with so many people. It was never only about fame. It was about surviving long enough to be fully seen. She did not just represent change on screen. She embodied the cost of reaching it. Few people grow up under a spotlight as bright and complicated as the one that followed Chaz Bono from birth. As the child of Sonny and Cher, he was linked to fame before he was old enough to understand what fame could demand from a person. To the public, he was part of a legendary family story, one more familiar face connected to Hollywood history and pop culture mythology. The harder story was the one unfolding in private. For years, Chaz was known to the world by a different name and expected to live inside an identity that never felt fully right. That kind of inner conflict is difficult enough in ordinary life. Inside a famous family, with cameras, headlines, and public curiosity always nearby, it became even more complicated. He was not only trying to understand himself, he was doing it while the world believed it already knew who he was supposed to be. As he grew older, that disconnect became harder to manage. What looked like a public life shaped by privilege carried a quieter struggle underneath it, one tied to discomfort, self-recognition, and the long process of finding the courage to stop performing for everyone else. When Chaz began his transition in adulthood, the change was not presented as a sudden reinvention. It felt more like a long-delayed alignment between the inner self and the outward life. He later underwent surgery and hormone therapy, taking steps that allowed him to feel more at home in his own body. That decision also reshaped how people saw him professionally. Over time, he built a career as a writer, activist, and actor, becoming one of the first trans men to bring that visibility into mainstream entertainment spaces. Cher later admitted that adjusting emotionally took time, even though her love for her child never disappeared. That detail matters because it reveals something honest about Chaz's journey. Acceptance is not always instant, even inside a family, but love can still grow stronger through that struggle. He was born into one of entertainment's most famous identities. His real turning point came when he finally claimed one of his own. Before the world fully understood how to describe Andreja Pejić, the fashion industry already knew it was looking at someone unusual. With striking features and an androgynous beauty that made designers and photographers pay attention immediately, she stood out in a business built on visual impact. Runways, editorials, and major fashion conversations turned her into a figure people could not easily categorize, and that uncertainty became part of her appeal. What looked groundbreaking on the outside still left something unresolved underneath. Long before Andreja embraced life openly as a woman, she was living with a tension that success could not erase. Growing up between Bosnia and Australia, she carried the kind of difference that could feel isolating before it ever became marketable. Fashion gave her a place where ambiguity was admired, but admiration is not the same as peace. The industry could celebrate the image while still not touching the deeper question of identity. That was the real divide in her story. She was being praised for existing between categories at the very moment she was trying to understand where she truly belonged. As her profile grew, so did the pressure of living in a form the public found fascinating, but she did not experience as complete. When she transitioned in 2014, the decision came with personal risk and professional uncertainty. A modeling career can be fragile even under ordinary circumstances, and changing how the world recognized her could have cost her everything she had built. Instead, the transition marked a new chapter. Andreja moved forward publicly as herself, and rather than fading from view, she became part of a historic shift in fashion's understanding of gender, visibility, and identity. Looking back, Andreja once imagined telling her younger self to hold on, because one day she would grow into the woman she was always meant to be. That thought carries the emotional center of her story. It was never only about beauty or industry firsts. It was about becoming whole, after being admired in fragments. The world first noticed the mystery in her image. What mattered most was the truth she eventually gave that image a name. Some people spend years hiding what they know about themselves. Others are forced to explain it before they are even old enough to understand why the world finds it difficult. That was part of what made Jennings's story so unusual from the beginning. Before she was old enough to live an ordinary childhood, she had already become one of the most visible young voices connected to the transgender experience. What many people saw as courage started much earlier as confusion, discomfort, and a longing that felt painfully simple. Even as a very young child, Chaz was drawn toward the things that felt natural to her, from the clothes she loved to the way she understood herself in relation to everyone around her. She corrected adults when they called her a boy, not to make a point, but because the mismatch felt that real. At one stage, she reportedly believed something magical might happen and change her body into one that matched the truth she already felt inside. That small detail captures the emotional center of her story better than any headline ever could. The difference in Chaz's life was that her family eventually responded with support instead of denial. That support did not remove every obstacle, but it changed everything about the ground she was standing on. She did not have to spend her entire childhood disappearing behind someone else's expectations. As she grew older, her journey became more public through interviews, advocacy, and television, and that brought a different kind of pressure. When a child becomes a symbol, people often forget there is still a child underneath all that attention. Chaz once described her experience in the clearest terms possible, saying she had a girl brain but was born in a boy's body. The line stayed with so many people because it turned a complex subject into something immediate and deeply human. Her story was never powerful just because the world saw it early. It was powerful because the truth in it was already there from the start. In professional sports, the public loves certainty. People want clear categories, easy rules, and simple answers about fairness, strength, and who belongs where. That is exactly why Fallon Fox became more than just an athlete. The moment her name entered a wider public conversation, she also became part of a much larger and more uncomfortable debate. Behind that debate was a life shaped by rejection long before competition ever entered the picture. Fallon grew up knowing she felt different, but understanding that difference and living it openly were two very different things. In a world where traditional gender expectations were enforced early and often, even admitting the truth to herself came with risk. When she eventually opened up about being transgender, the response inside her own family was painful rather than comforting. Instead of support, she was met with disbelief and the damaging idea that something so deeply felt could somehow be corrected. That kind of rejection leaves a mark long before anyone steps into a ring. Even so, Fallon moved forward with her transition and chose to live as herself despite the emotional cost. Later, when she entered mixed martial arts, she did not walk into a neutral arena. She walked straight into one of the most unforgiving public spaces for a transgender woman. Once she became known as the first openly transgender fighter in MMA, her career was no longer judged only by skill, discipline, or performance. It was filtered through controversy, argument, and constant scrutiny. Every match seemed to carry a second fight around it, one that had less to do with sport itself and more to do with whether people were willing to accept her presence there at all. Fallon later made it clear that she did not enter sports to become a political symbol. She entered because she was an athlete. That distinction matters because it shows how often public controversy can swallow the human being at the center of it. She was not only fighting opponents in the cage, she was fighting the limits of what the public was willing to understand. Next, we have the fierce and unforgettable Carmen Carrera. She first caught the public's attention on RuPaul's Drag Race, where her beauty, glamour, and commanding presence made her one of the most talked-about personalities of her season. On screen, she had the kind of look that pulled focus immediately, and for many viewers, that was where the fascination began. But what came after that visibility mattered far more than the first impression. After her time on the show, Carmen stepped into a much more personal transition, one that changed the way the public looked at her and the way she wanted to be understood. For some people, the shift was not easy to follow. They had become attached to the drag persona, the performance, the image they already knew how to categorize. What they struggled to accept was that Carmen was not simply changing an aesthetic. She was moving closer to the truth of who she was. That is what gave her journey a different emotional weight. Transitioning in public always comes with exposure, but doing it after already becoming visible in entertainment adds another layer of pressure. People do not just watch. They compare, question, and decide whether they are willing to let someone redefine themselves outside the version that first entertained them. Carmen kept moving anyway. In time, her story also became part of a wider conversation inside the LGBTQ+ community, especially around language, respect, and the way transgender women are spoken about in media spaces that claim to celebrate difference while still carrying old habits. At one point, Carmen publicly criticized language she found demeaning, and that moment revealed something important about her role in the culture. She was not only living openly, she was also willing to challenge the terms on which that visibility was being offered. She may have entered the spotlight as a spectacle for television. She stayed in it as a woman refusing to be defined by anyone else's script. Her transformation remains one of the most public and widely discussed in modern celebrity culture. Long before the world knew Caitlyn Jenner by that name, the public knew Bruce Jenner as an Olympic champion, a symbol of discipline, achievement, and American success. Gold, medal glory, television fame, and later a place inside one of the most watched families in pop culture gave that image extraordinary staying power. But even a life that looked complete from the outside was hiding a much longer private conflict. For years, the public saw certainty where there was actually struggle. Behind the medals, the marriages, and the carefully maintained image, Caitlyn was living with feelings that had followed her since childhood. She has spoken about experimenting privately with women's clothing at a young age, trying to understand emotions that had no easy place in the world she was growing up in. That inner divide never simply disappeared under success. Sports gave her structure. Fame gave her visibility. Neither one resolved the deeper question underneath. As the years passed, that conflict remained, even while her public role expanded through reality, television, and family life in front of millions. By the time she transitioned in her 60s, the decision felt shocking to much of the world, not because the truth had appeared overnight, but because so many people had mistaken a carefully built public identity for the whole person. When Caitlyn appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair in 2015 with the words, "Call me Caitlyn," the moment instantly became larger than celebrity news. It marked a cultural turning point, one that forced mainstream audiences to confront a transgender story on a scale they could not easily ignore. Caitlyn later said that all her life she had been getting ready for this and had no idea. That line captured the strange emotional weight of her journey better than any headline did. It suggested that even decades of success can still leave the most important truth waiting in the background. The world remembered the athlete, the father, the television figure. What made history was the moment that public image finally gave way to a more honest life. Maybe that is the most powerful part of stories like these. The world often focuses on what changed on the outside, but the real journey usually begins much deeper than that. Behind every public moment was a personal choice to live more honestly, more openly, and with a kind of courage that deserves to be remembered. Each of these 8 celebrities followed a different path, but all of them helped create more visibility, more understanding, and more space for people to be seen as they truly are. That is what gives these stories their lasting impact. They are not only about transformation, they are also about strength, hope, and the freedom that comes with finally living in your truth. So tell me, which story touched you the most, and who would you love to see us talk about in a future video? And if you enjoy exploring stories like these with us, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. There is always more to discover behind the spotlight.